Hello everyone, bringing you a video today looking at the Soldiers Handbook. Now this is an Australian Army publication from the mid-1960s. I believe it was issued until at least the early 1970s, although a clearer date, a more exact date of exactly when this became obsolete or when it was no longer issued would be interesting to know. So if anyone does know, if you could comment down below, that would be much appreciated. The book itself provides a lot of information. It was obviously intended as a basic handbook for the Australian soldier of the time. And this, of course, is a very interesting time period. It's during Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. So it's quite a useful historical document from that point of view. We're going to have a look at quite a lot of this in some detail, not the entire book though. This isn't an exhaustive run through every page, but I will pause, and obviously those that we look at, hopefully the picture quality will be good enough that you can have a detailed look. I do recommend picking a copy of this up if you can find one, and if you're interested in this time period of the Australian Army and particularly involvement in the Vietnam War. The copies of this do show up on eBay fairly regularly, and they do turn up for sale elsewhere as well. So definitely an interesting document to have if you can find a copy of it, and I highly recommend doing so. Without further ado, we'll have a look at this in some detail in the main part of the video now. So here we have the Soldiers Handbook, and you can see the date that this was notified, 1965, in the top right corner there. And this green sort of mottled cover, card cover. Obviously restricted at the time, so not restricted now, of course, well out of date, but nevertheless an interesting piece of history, interesting reference piece, if nothing else. Inside cover there, the foreword. I'm not going to flick through every page, obviously, because that will take a very, very long time, but hopefully you can see from the contents list here, this is, if you can find one of these, and they do turn up relatively frequently on eBay, that's where I got mine, and on other online booksellers. You can find them on websites elsewhere, and obviously I imagine in Australia itself they're very easy to find. You can see from the contents list here it's well worth having one of these. So you've got everything there from sort of dress regulations, drill, you've got fieldcraft, living in the field, first aid, communications. It's very all-encompassing in that regard. It doesn't go into everything in huge detail, of course it can't, not in a book this thick, but it's a good overview, and it provides a good overview of the Australian soldier, at least as the Army would like them to have been in the middle 1960s, and obviously that's what you get from a handbook like this, is a basic overview of everything a soldier would be expected to know. So you have, I've skipped over a section at the beginning here, which is the history of the Australian Army. Let's see if I can split this page here. There we go. Didn't want to turn. History of the Australian Army. So I'll flick through these sections here, and you can pause and hopefully read if you wish to. Hopefully the quality is good enough to do so. Obviously these sections are interesting of what exactly was the history that's being presented to soldiers at the time in the Soldiers Handbook. And they have the Army today, defence policy and so forth. So again, pause here. Quite a nice diagram there, quite a nice map showing the different commands in Australia itself and in Papua New Guinea. Hopefully if I pause there you'll be able to read all of that should you wish to. We have further details here, and then the structure of an Australian division at the time. You see there? Again, quite a neat diagram. We'll rattle through these so you can pause and have a look should you wish to. Conditions of service, very important of course. A little more detail on that here. And then we'll flick through to obviously living in barracks and security and so forth. You have here details on uniform and dress, which is I guess quite useful from a reenactor's point of view. So we have here the winter service dress for ceremonial purposes and battle dress for ceremonial purposes there. The details underneath of what was to be worn, what could be worn. And then the same here, you have blue ceremonial dress, so blues, and the summer dress for ceremonial and tropical dress for ceremonial. And then you have basic battle dress, basic service dress. Summer dress, tropical dress, and then field dress, which is of course the Australian green, uniform the greens. Drill shirt and trousers in jungle green, and a jungle green colour, basically. And details there. Nice colour page towards the middle here, which includes the ranks of the Navy and the Air Force for comparison, and then rather nice colour page there detailing medal ribbons and other devices. You have the oak leaves there for mentioned in dispatches, and then the 8 there, which is the clasp for the 8th Army, the Africa Star clasp for the 8th Army, and to the right there. Continue on through. Further details on dress, the wearing of the felt hat, as it's described here, the slouch hat. Quite useful detail there. And then we have here the wearing of the beret and the positioning of collar badges on the uniform, the service dress uniform. Continue on through. Go through to here. We have a section here on drill, which is basically standard SLR drill for the time. So you can see that here. Well, this is basic foot drill, a little bit with the rifle there. And then another section here shows you the various positions. And then we have a section on the weapons themselves. So we have the L1A1 self-loading rifle here, as you can see. It's a standard infantry rifle, the Australian Army at the time. The L2 is mentioned here, along with some further details on the L1A1. Of course, the heavy barrel version of the self-loading rifle that could fire in full automatic as a support weapon. Australians did use it, as did Canada. They had their own version, the C2. Not something adopted by Britain, of course. And then details of the Owen machine carbine here. Interesting to see the machine carbine nomenclature still being used. That was something it was a term used by British Empire and British Dominion forces, British Commonwealth forces, and took a little while to switch over to submachine gun. But basically it is a submachine gun, it's just machine carbine was the previous term used. More on weapons here, so you have the number 36 grenade, the Mills bomb. And that's the end of the section on weapons. Obviously that would come to change greatly as more US munitions were brought into stocks during the course of the Vietnam War. Section here on shooting, and targets and so forth. You can see there. It's interesting to note here, the Australian soldier illustrated at the time. You can find a good shot here, that's not a bad shot. And the one above is good as well. Using M1956 equipment, of course, the US designed equipment, wearing Australian greens, the M1 helmet, and the SLR. So the only weapon carried, it's only the weapon carry that really sort of harkens back to the British influence in Australian kit. The equipment is American, the uniform is Australian, and the helmet, of course, is American as well. Still wearing ankle boots with leggings or gaiters, as you can see there. The GP boot hadn't quite arrived on the scene at this point. But an interesting thing to see there, the Australian soldier obviously moving away from British influenced kit to using US kit. You can see further shooting positions there. Section here on map reading. Move into here. Some further nice colour illustrations here. Section on using the compass as well, as you can see in here. Again, good illustration there of the kit and stuff that's been used at the time as well. Carry on through, we have fieldcraft. Quite a lot of this is derived from Second World War developments, interestingly. Quite a lot of it harkens back to Second War training pamphlets, both British and Australian. If you find a good way of doing something, you carry on doing it that way, so it's not surprising that things carried across. Various details here on camouflaging yourself, and then we move into, a little bit later on, we'll move into moving in prone position and so forth. Interesting thing to notice in this illustration here, this photograph, is that the opposing forces are based on, or certainly appear to be based on, communist terrorists from the Malayan Emergency era, particularly the Caps. So interesting just to see how the experience of Australian troops, Australian forces in Malaya, had clearly influenced training for the opposing forces in this photograph here. Moving through, we have obviously judging distances and so forth, using range cards and so forth to indicate targets. You can see that here. And through here, I was saying further fieldcraft, so moving in prone position and so forth there. Again, this is carried over really from Second War experience. And then we have field hand signals, which is quite a useful thing, again, I would say, from a reenacting point of view. So cover these pages in full. Hopefully again you can pause here and take a closer look at these if you wish to. We're already nearly 10 minutes into this section of filming just looking at the book. So hand signals there, obviously formations for moving forward. You've got a single file, staggered file, arrowhead and so forth, you can see there. And then platoon formations, so looking at much smaller units here compared to the division we saw earlier in the book, division formation. See that there. Much more applicable to operations in Vietnam, of course. And then you have living in the field, which details various different types of shelter that could be built with the Australian hooch, the Australian basher. Not exhaustive, I'm sure. I'm sure there are other ways of doing this developed in the field, but these are just some of the examples in the book. Daily routine and so forth. And then we've health and hygiene here, which not only includes, obviously, hygiene and individual health and hygiene, but also first aid as well. We'll see that a little bit further on. And first aid is the next section along, as you can see here. This is quite interesting. It has an illustration here. I'll just show these pages as well. There's an interesting illustration here of the circulatory system, which is quite useful if you're trying to deal with a wound. It gives you an idea of where the bleeding is coming from. We have a section here on communications, which deals with Morse and the phonetic alphabet, of course, which you can see there. And then details on jointing wires and radios. A section there as well. Nice illustrations. And then we have Annex A and Annex B at the back, which is the Geneva Convention in Annex A, and the Code of Conduct if taken prisoner of war at Annex B. So that's the Australian Army Soldiers Handbook from 1965. Certainly a very useful document, one I've found very interesting. It's a good snapshot of the Australian soldier in the mid-1960s. And as I say, these aren't that difficult to come by. If you can find one, I highly recommend picking a copy up if this is an area of interest for you. So hopefully it's been interesting having a look at this. It couldn't be completely comprehensive, of course, that would have taken rather too long, but hopefully the information that's been shown in this video is of use. The sections of the book we've actually looked at, hopefully they've been of interest, and as I say, if you can find a copy of one of these, I highly recommend picking it up. So I do hope you found it interesting looking at this. I'm certainly very pleased to have a copy of this. I found it to be a very useful resource, and it's quite interesting, just the sheer amount of ground that's covered in this, and it's very interesting to see the information that was provided to Australian soldiers at the time in the form of this sort of basic handbook. If you have found this interesting and you'd like to see more from the channel, please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as ever, a huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It really is greatly appreciated. As I always say, thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address in the description as well. That's everything for this video. So until next time, bye for now.